Good morning, everyone. If we could ask everyone to please begin taking your seats, our program is going to start very shortly. Please, everyone, take your seats. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, or almost good afternoon. We want to thank you all for coming out to our conference this morning. I am Therese Cairo. I am the SDC Commissioner Treasurer for SDC. Just wanted to let you guys know we appreciate you guys being here to learn or to increase your knowledge base about housing and the lack of equal housing around the world. I am the president and CEO of a CDFI here in Milwaukee, Legacy Redevelopment, and woohoo! And it's very important to me that we understand the importance of housing and how we all can be in a better place if we were offered equal housing across the board. Whether you're getting rents. I talked to a young lady this morning who spoke a little bit about some of the issues she's facing. Home ownership is key. It is the key to a lot of generational wealth gaps that we're all experiencing, and a lot of people aren't given that information. This conversation today, I hope we all leave here with something that we didn't know before we got here, and how we all can be voices for the voiceless. So I want to introduce to you our fearless leader, our SDC fearless leader, Dr. George Hinton, who will set the tone for what's going to happen this afternoon and what we all are looking so forward to hearing. Dr. Hinton?
Good morning, everyone. My name is George Hinton. I am the CEO of SDC. And I want to first of all thank all the staff that's here from SDC, because this program would not be possible without their support and their help and their dedication and all that good stuff that goes on to make things happen. I am extremely excited about today and about this opportunity to have this discussion, this learning opportunity. I plan to learn a lot personally about housing. I've been at SDC now for 8 years, going on 9 years, and I just didn't know, and I'll put it like that. You know, we can live in a community for a long, long time and still be blind and ignorant to some of the factors that we all need to probably open ourselves up to. And so one of the things we've tried to do over the years is take this opportunity to begin to learn, understand, and then take action. Learn, understand, and then take action, because I'm from healthcare, and one of the things they taught me is what you see is not the problem. It's what the problem is that makes what you see happen. And so we're gonna have to start thinking differently if we wanna change what's going on in our community, regardless if it's housing, food insecurity, healthcare, and those types of things. So this program is specifically designed to give information to you so that you can begin to hear from a speaker who's been all around the world talking about housing, and really gives us a better understanding of the historical aspects of why we're here, and then some of the current things that are going on to keep us with the way we are today. These are all important, because if you don't understand the processes and the systems that make up what we have going on in our community, how can you truly fix it? How can you truly re-engineer what needs to be re-engineered to make a difference, to have a different outcome? So I'm extremely, extremely excited about hearing this presentation. One, we're gonna do this every quarter, except for the quarter in which we do our Poverty Summit, where we bring different speakers who can talk to us, either locally or nationally or across the world, around issues that we're having here in Milwaukee County. And then taking this opportunity to then have begin the process of talking about what is the root cause, what are the transformative things that we need to do to make sure that our community is not the same as it was in the future. How do we make sure that we transform our community into the one that's more like the one we all want it to be, collectively, individually? So I'm excited. I think it's gonna be a wonderful day. So that's what the program's all about. That's what we're trying to do on a quarterly basis, and then our Poverty Summit, of course, is the big opportunity to bring in various speakers from all over across the country and across our community, and then bring us together so we can continue that discussion. The next thing on my agenda that I'm supposed to talk about is, looking for hints. No, I'm not. I'm going to introduce my chair. That's what I'm going to do. So the next thing I'm going to do is introduce Chair Moore, our chair of the SDC, Social Development Commission. He's going to do a short video. He wasn't able to be here today. I'm excited about his new opportunity with WIDA. And so he's here to speak in behalf of our agency and talk about some of the wonderful tools that we need for you to make us the better agency, and I'll talk about that after he's done. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Elmer Moore, and I'm chairman of the Board of Commissioners for the Social Development Commission. It is vitally important that you complete this survey so that we can understand what you need and what's important to you. In that survey, we're going to ask you about your household and your demographics. We want to understand who's in your home and what matters to you and them. We want to understand the impact that COVID-19 may or may not have had on your everyday life. Finally, we want to understand the other issues that we can support as we are doing this work together. This is how we can hear your voice. Complete the survey, send it back, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.
Well, I talk a little bit. I'm going to ask Jennifer to come up. SDC is leadership from many seats, and so I want to bring up one of our leaders in our organization that's responsible for helping us to move in another direction. After Jennifer's done talking, I'm going to talk a little about SDC before I pass this over to Abra, who's going to introduce our keynote today. But there's a reason why SDC is doing what we're trying to do now, and I'm going to give a little bit of insight into that and ask you to join us as we go through a journey of change and reimagination of what SDC is.
All right, thank you, Dr. Hinton. Good afternoon, everyone. A little bit better than that. Good afternoon. All right, I appreciate that energy. Seeing faces that I'm familiar with. Hey, I didn't say hi earlier. But really taking the opportunity to say thank you in advance. Thank you for participating. Thank you for participating and making sure that we hear Milwaukee's voice. We hear your voice. If you're a resident of Milwaukee County, we have the opportunity for you today to participate in the needs assessment. Actually, right now, in front of you, there is a table tent, and that table tent gives you information about the needs assessment. Now, I'm going to ask a really personal question. How many people in the room have already done the needs assessment? All right, for those that haven't raised their hand, please clap for those people. Thank you for going ahead and taking that step and changing and doing the transformative work that Dr. Hinton has mentioned. And so us moving forward, we're taking this information and it is helping to steer our organization. So if you have not, those that didn't raise your hand, please, before you leave today or at home before the end of the week, go to SDC's website. It's a prompt that'll take you directly to our survey, and it'll only take you about 15 or so minutes. If you're like me, it took me a little longer because I had things to say. But we really need your insight so we can bring it back to our commissioners to help inform the work that we do forward, to strengthen our programs, and make that true transformative change. Only take you 15 minutes, and I thank you again in advance.
So let me give you a story about SDC. Back in 1963, during the times of the uprisings, civil disorder across the country, a lot of issues around racism and those types of things. And at that time, Mayor Meyer decided that he was going to put a commission together to deal with the issues that were affecting not only Milwaukee, but major cities and townships and rural areas across the country. And he created the Social Development Commission. That commission is responsible for studying. I got it. Keep going. For those of you online, I just want you to know I have a coach, a handler that's telling me exactly what I do. I just don't know the sign languages yet. That really helped. The SDC was charged with looking at studying and then working with our community to make recommendations to help change, transformative changes that were needed in the country at that time, for specifically around people who were living in a segregated, very racist community, racist society. And so that organization was created, maybe not with the same thought patterns that we have today, but at least it was created, and they had some wonderful language around its creating, just like our Declaration of Independence. So, fast forward a couple years later, 1965, community action agencies were created. These are organizations that's mission are to provide resources to individuals in poverty so they can move out of poverty, work with communities to do so. So SDC is not one agency. It's actually two agencies in one. It's a community action agency, like one of 1,000 in the United States, and it's a commission on poverty that's supposed to speak to those issues that are barriers for people to move from poverty, to work with our community, to educate ourselves so we can better understand what systems are in place that may be keeping people from moving forward in life as we would expect they should be able to do in a country that's wealthiest in the world. So that's the work we're doing. So we kind of lost that a little bit as we went from 1965 to 2000, and so we're trying to reimagine what that looks like today and asking the question. That's why the needs assessment is important, because the thoughts of our community is extremely important for the mission of SDC. But we also understand that our mission also is to make sure that we educate and to give information to our community, and then challenge our community to change and not just accept what they see, but look for why it is, and then look for changes around the why. So we're pretty excited about these opportunities to do so. And that's why we're doing this today, and that's why we will continue to do it, because we're more just a program agency. Our goal is to work ourselves out of existence. The self-perpetuation of services that are just doing transactional work is not going to resolve the issues that we have in our community. So we're looking to change the way we think and the way we address problems. So please work with us, join us, regardless of where you sit, and help us to do a better job as an agency. I know our commissioners are engaged in this process, and so is SDC. I hope those of you online, as well as those of you here today, hear what I have to say, have questions, help us to be better by asking tough questions, making suggestions, and being part of the solution. I now will introduce Abra Fortson to come up and introduce our great speaker. At the end of the day, after the speaker is done, Martinelli, I know many of you know him. I'm not going to talk about it. He's going to come up and tell him who he is if you don't know Frank Martinelli. He's been around forever. He is the guy who talks about root cause. And we're going to have a little exercise before we're done. So if you have time to stay, stay, because we're going to start talking about how do we look at problems differently, how do we assess problems differently, and what can we do differently as a community to begin to address these issues that we see across our community in many different ways. All right? Aber Fortson. Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome, boss. So we are a little bit premature because this information that Mr. Rothstein is going to come and share with us is so critically important. We need the room quieted. So what we'd like to do is give our wait staff an opportunity to distribute food so that there is no clattering of that kind of stuff as Mr. Rothstein comes to the podium. So I'd like to take a moment to allow food to be distributed, and then I'll come back before you and introduce our keynote. Is that all right? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. And so we are back. It is that time where we introduce our illustrious, hardworking, world-conscious speaker. Richard Rothstein is a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute and senior fellow emeritus at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He is the author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, which recovers a forgotten history of how federal, state, and local policy explicitly segregated metropolitan areas nationwide, creating racially homogeneous neighborhoods, ghettos, in patterns that violate the Constitution and that require remediation. He is also the author of many articles and books on race and education, which can be found on his webpage at the Economic Policy Institute. Feel free to look at our website for the web address for Mr. Rothstein's access for his materials. Previous influential books include Class in Schools Using Social, Economic, and Educational Reform to Close the Black and White Achievement Gap, and Grading Education, Getting Accountability Right. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to some and introduce to others Mr. Richard Rothstein.
Thanks very much, Abra. And thanks to all of you for engaging with me in this conversation today. I can't help but mentioning that this is the first talk I've given on this topic in 2 years. The last one I gave was in Austin, Texas in March of 2020. And when I finished the talk, I got on my plane to go home, and when we were in midair, the pilot announced that Austin had just shut down. They'd canceled South by Southwest because of the pandemic, and I haven't been anywhere since. So thank you very much. By the way, I put on my, it's the first time I've worn a suit in 2 years, and I put it on here in the hotel this morning and looked in the mirror and saw that I have shrunk quite a bit since the last time I gave a talk. My doctor says, caution, continence will settle during shipping for people my age. So thanks for putting up with me. Let me begin by reminding all of us that in the 20th century, we had a civil rights movement in this country. It began by challenging segregation in law schools, then went on to challenge segregation in colleges and universities. And then in 1954, as you all know, it persuaded the Supreme Court to prohibit legal segregation of elementary and secondary schools. And that Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954 gave impetus, stimulus, inspiration to a movement of activists. They engaged in marches, demonstrations, civil disobedience. Some people lost their lives in that struggle. But by the end of the 1960s, that civil rights movement had pretty much persuaded much of the country, not everybody, as we know today, but pretty much persuaded much of the country that racial segregation was wrong, it was immoral, it was harmful both to blacks and to whites, it was incompatible with our self-conception as a democratic society. And with that understanding, the civil rights movement persuaded Congress to abolish segregation in public accommodations, public transportation, employment. And then in 1968, in the wake of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., It succeeded in getting a Fair Housing Act passed that prohibited ongoing discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. But then the civil rights movement pretty much ended, went home, and left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country, Milwaukee is no different, every metropolitan area of this country is residentially segregated. Clearly defined areas that are all white or mostly white, clearly defined areas that are either all black or mostly black. How could it be? If we came to an understanding that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both blacks and whites, incompatible with the idea of a democratic society, how could we tolerate continuing to live in an apartheid society? Well, I think partly it's because undoing residential segregation once we created it is hard. If we abolish segregation in buses, for example, after the Montgomery bus boycott that Rosa Parks inspired, if we abolish segregation in public transportation, the next day anybody can get on any bus, get on any train, and sit anywhere they like. But if we abolish segregation in neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. And so what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, blacks and whites, liberals, conservatives, northerners, southerners, Democrats, Republicans, we've adopted a national myth, a rationalization we give ourselves for failing to continue the civil rights revolution and leaving untouched this biggest segregation of all. And the rationalization goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregation of colleges and universities or schools or buses or restaurants, that was all done by government. If there was a law, an ordinance requiring restaurants to be segregated, that was in violation of the 14th Amendment, the civil rights violation, something we all have an obligation as Americans to redress, to fix. If the government was requiring African Americans to move out of non-segregated cars when a train crossed the Mason-Dixon line, that was a federal violation of the Constitution, a violation of the Fifth Amendment, something that we all have an obligation to fix. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves, oh, that's something entirely different. That wasn't done by government. That wasn't done by law, by regulation, by public policy. That just sort of happened naturally, happened by accident. The reason we're residentially segregated is, oh, maybe bigoted white homeowners or landlords refuse to sell or rent to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or maybe it's because developers and banks and real estate agencies, all private sector businesses, discriminated in how they carried out their purely private sector activities. Or maybe we tell ourselves, oh, it's just because people like to live with each other of the same race. We feel more comfortable that way. That's why we're segregated. Or maybe we say it's all just the result of economics. On average, African Americans have lower incomes than whites, not in every case, but on average. And so many African Americans can't afford to move to more expensive neighborhoods. All of these individual, bigoted, discriminatory, private sector activities, self-choice, economic differences, this is what's created residential segregation. And we tell ourselves what happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. What happened naturally can only unhappen naturally. We give a name to this rationalization that we have. We say that what we've got is de facto segregation, just something that happened in fact, not in law. Well, I spent, as you could tell perhaps from Abra's introduction, I spent much of my time before I wrote this book, The Color of Law, studying education policy and writing about education policy. I was not a housing expert, still not. Wasn't writing really about residential segregation. I was writing about education. And in the 1990s and 2000s, early 2000s, I was a critic of the dominant educational theory in this country. It was, again, broadly supported, both Democrats and Republicans, all across the country. We thought that the reason that black children achieved at lower levels on average than white children, we called it an achievement gap. The reason that black children achieved at low levels was because teachers were bigoted. They had low expectations of black children. They just didn't try very hard. And only if we could make teachers try harder, the achievement gap would disappear. I thought this was a ludicrous theory, and I wrote article after article about it. I was a newspaper columnist at the time, denouncing the theory. Of course, there are some teachers who are lazy and don't try very hard, but that's a trivial cause of the achievement gap. The main reason for the achievement gap, the main reason we have an achievement gap between black and white children, is because so many African American children come to school with serious social and economic challenges that impede their ability to learn. And I remember writing one column in my newspaper column, it was in the New York Times, about asthma. As you may know, African American children in urban neighborhoods have asthma at about 4 times the rate of middle-class children. It's an enormous difference, 4 times the rate. And they have asthma because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more trucks driving by their homes, more vermin in the environment, more dilapidated buildings. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than a child who does not. Always I'm talking about averages, it's not true in every case, but a child with asthma is more likely than a child who is not to be up at night wheezing and then coming to school drowsy the next day. And if you have 2 groups of children, identical in every respect, same racial composition of the 2 groups, same social and economic background, same family structure, but one group happens to have a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group's going to have lower average achievement simply because it's going to be drowsier in school. Now, asthma is not a big cause of the achievement gap, it's a tiny cause, but then you begin to think of all the other social and economic challenges that African American children from heavily minority neighborhoods come to school with. Asthma, lead poisoning. Lead poisoning has a measurable impact on IQ. Homelessness, economic insecurity, evictions. You add all of these up, and you've pretty much explained the achievement gap. Every one of these disadvantages, in one way or another, impedes the ability of children to learn. Well, I was writing column after column about this. I wrote a book, as you heard, called Class and Schools, that explains the causes of the achievement gap. People used to make fun of me as being the toothache theorist of segregation, because I explained that because African American children have such little access to dental care, routine dental care, compared to white middle-class children, many of them have toothaches, and that also distracts them during school. Well, it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic security or lack of dental care. It's another thing we have a school where every child has one or more of these challenges. How can such a school ever be expected, no matter how much you raise teacher expectations, how can such a school ever be expected to achieve at the same level as a middle-class school? Well, you can't. It's a ludicrous expectation. Nonetheless, we passed a national law called the No Child Left Behind Law, which required that children be tested every year, that the scores be reported by race, and the law predicted that if you only did this, you would shame teachers so much they would work harder and the achievement gap would disappear. This was in 2021. It's really, even after 20 years thinking about this, it's incredible we could have passed such a stupid law. But, 20 years or more later, the achievement gap is still here. We're testing children ad nauseum, but hasn't had any impact on the achievement gap. The only thing that No Child Left Behind law ever accomplished was it got teachers to abandon a well-rounded curriculum and spend an inordinate amount of time drilling children in test-taking skills. Well, this is what I was thinking about back in that time, and I gradually realized that when you concentrate children in schools with all these disadvantages, we call them segregated schools, by the way, and schools are more segregated today than they have been at any time in the last 45 years. When you concentrate children in schools like this, the achievement gap cannot disappear, and the reason that they're concentrated in the schools like that is because the neighborhoods in which the schools are located are segregated. So I began to realize I'm a slow learner, but I began to realize that neighborhood segregation was the biggest educational problem we face in this country. And I began to wonder what we could do about it. Again, I was thinking about it as an education policy analyst. And then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision that evaluated a program that 2 school districts had, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. Both of these school districts had a very, very token school desegregation plan. They gave parents the choice of which school in the district their child would attend, but if the choice was going to exacerbate racial segregation, it wouldn't be honored in favor of the choice of a child who wouldn't do so. So you had an all-white, a mostly white school. Both a black and a white child applied for the last remaining place in that school. Black child be given some preference, help to desegregate the school. This was a trivial program. I mean, how often do you have one place left in the school? And you have a black and a white child applying for it. But the Supreme Court evaluated this program, denounced it, said you couldn't do such a thing. It was against the Constitution to do this kind of thing. The opinion was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. He explained, he said, yes, it's true, the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated. But he went on to say that the schools are segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. It was a wise observation on his part. And then he went on to explain that the neighborhoods in Louisville and Seattle are segregated de facto because of private bigotry and the discrimination by private companies and people wanting to live with each other of the same race and economic differences. And he said, well, you have de facto segregation, something that wasn't done by government. It's against the Constitution for government to fix it. Well, I read this decision, and I remembered reading about something that had happened in Louisville, Kentucky some years before. In Louisville, there was a white homeowner in an all-white suburb of single-family homes called Shively. This white homeowner in the suburb of Louisville had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville, renting an apartment. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had the wife and a child. He had a good job. He wanted to buy a single-family home, but no real estate agent would sell him one. So the white friend living in this suburb of Shively bought a second home in his community and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. Police made no effort to stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home. The police made no effort to stop that either. But when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition for having sold a home to a black family in a white neighborhood. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. The police, the courts, the entire criminal justice system, this is agents of state government. This is a blatant constitutional violation. Nothing de facto about this. And then I began to look into it further. And I found, and I'm not exaggerating here, there were hundreds and hundreds of cases nationwide, here, in Chicago, in Boston, in New York, and San Francisco, and Los Angeles, and Detroit, and Kansas City, everywhere. Police protected, sometimes even police-led and organized mob violence to drive African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods. Every one of them a constitutional violation. Every one of them giving the lie to the notion of de facto segregation. I then began to look into it further, and I found that there were many, many other federal, state, and local policies, racially explicit policies that were designed to ensure that blacks and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area of this country, that the apartheid society in which we live is a government creation. Well, let me describe a few of these. I don't have a lot of time. I could talk for many years about this, and sometimes it seems like I have. But let me describe a few of the most powerful policies that the federal government followed in order to impose segregation on this society in an unconstitutional fashion that requires remedy. Perhaps the most famous of them, most well-known, is a policy that the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administrations followed in the immediate post-World War II period to suburbanize the entire white population into single-family homes like those I described outside Louisville, into single-family homes, and prohibit African Americans from doing the same. This was a racially explicit policy. At the time, we weren't a suburban country. The suburbs that we all take for granted now had barely existed in the immediate post-World War II period. Both whites and blacks, middle-class, working-class families were living in urban areas, in many cases in integrated downtown urban areas. We'd be stunned if we were transported back 60, 70 years ago to see the extent of integration that existed in some places. We were a manufacturing economy. Factories had to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals to get their parts or ship their final products. So they had to be located in downtown areas, and the workers in these factories or in the banks that serviced them, or the other service industries, needed to walk to work, take short streetcar rides. Automobiles weren't widespread at the time for working class, middle class families. And so you had downtown areas with both blacks and whites. The Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration embarked on a policy to move all the whites out of those areas into single-family homes in the suburbs and leave the African Americans concentrated there in urban areas. You've probably heard, well, they exist here in Milwaukee, these suburbs. They exist in every metropolitan area. Perhaps the most famous one nationwide is Levittown. You've probably read about it. 17,000 homes east of New York City. 17,000 homes in one place. The builder, William Levitt, wanted to buy the land and build these homes. No bank would be crazy enough to lend the money to do it. He tried. Banks turned him down. They thought this was a crazy idea. Who's going to want to live in a suburban community? The only way he could build this development, and the same thing is true of developers here in Milwaukee and in Chicago and in every other city of the country, the only way he could do it was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, two federal agencies, submitting his plans for the development, the architectural design of the homes, the materials he's going to use, the layout of the streets, and a federally required commitment that he never sell a home to an African American. The federal government even required Levitt, and this is true here as well, and I'll mention a little bit later, some people are doing research here in Milwaukee about it. The federal government even required that Levitt put a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. And those clauses still exist in these deeds today. Here in Milwaukee, they're not enforceable anymore. Here in Milwaukee, in Levittown, and everywhere in the country. This was a racially explicit policy of the federal government. It wasn't the action of rogue bureaucrats. It was a racially explicit written policy. The Federal Housing Administration had an underwriting manual that it distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to evaluate the applications of developers who wanted federal bank guarantees for their loans to build these suburban developments. The underwriting manual said that you could not recommend for a federal bank guarantee a development that was going to include African Americans. The manual went so far as to say that you couldn't even get a federal bank guarantee for an all-white project if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. It's complete nonsense. There's no such thing. In my book, The Color of Law, that I guess you have a picture of here, some of you may have read it, you'll see that I have a photograph there of a project in Detroit, just outside Detroit, a white project that has a 6-foot-high, half-mile-long concrete wall that the Federal Housing Administration required the developer to construct to separate his development from a nearby African-American neighborhood. That's how explicit the federal policy was. Well, this policy created a white noose around every metropolitan area of this country, white suburbs surrounding black neighborhoods. The families who bought these homes in the mid-20th century with federal bank guarantees, with mortgages issued by the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, these were working-class families. These weren't middle-class families. These were working-class families, returning war veterans. They had jobs in the post-war economy. Both blacks and whites had those jobs. Only whites were permitted to buy the homes. The homes at that time, in those dollars, cost about $8,000 apiece. In today's money, that's about $100,000. About twice national median income. Anybody with an income that's twice national median income can afford to buy a home for $100,000. Whites were subsidized by the federal government to do it. Blacks were prohibited. Well, today, as you know, those homes no longer sell for $100,000. Not here in the Milwaukee suburbs, not in Levittown, not anywhere in the country. They sell for $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. The whites families who bought those homes with federal bank guarantees didn't expect to get wealthy from buying those homes. They didn't know that the prices of those homes were going to rise. So these were, as I say, working-class families needing a place to live in the post-war boom, when there was very little housing constructed, because private housing constructed, because the war had absorbed all construction materials. In the Depression before that, there was very little construction going on. So these whites who bought these homes, working-class families, then became wealthy because the homes appreciated in value. If they have a home that they bought for $100,000, and a couple of generations later, they or their children or grandchildren have homes worth $400,000 or $500,000, that's several $100,000 in wealth that they accumulated through no fault of their own. They used that wealth to send their children to college. They used it to perhaps take care of temporary emergencies, maybe temporary unemployment, maybe medical emergency. They used it to subsidize their retirements. And they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by explicit federal policy from accumulating wealth in a similar fashion. On top of that, because the Federal Housing Administration would not insure mortgages for African Americans, even in African American neighborhoods in the urban areas, African Americans were exploited by speculators who charged them far more than the houses were worth, far more than they would have charged them, been able to charge them had the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration been subsidizing them. So African Americans simultaneously became poorer and poorer at the same time that whites were becoming richer and richer, all because of this federal housing policy. Well, that wealth gap continues to this day that was created by these policies in large part, not entirely, but in large part. African American incomes on average are about 60% of white incomes today. You would think that if African American incomes are 60% of white incomes on average, African American wealth will also be 60% of white wealth. You can save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But in reality, although African American incomes average about 60% of white incomes, African American wealth is about 5% of white wealth. That enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to this unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century, and that's never been remedied, and that every one of us as Americans has an obligation, if we take our responsibilities as American citizens seriously, has an obligation to remedy. Well, that wealth gap creates, as I began by describing, the achievement gap in schools, because African Americans are locked into low-income neighborhoods where they have no opportunity to have the wealth that would enable them to purchase homes in higher opportunity areas. The wealth gap is responsible for health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans, as you know, have shorter life expectancies on average, greater rates of cardiovascular disease, because they live in more polluted, more dangerous neighborhoods, less access to grocery stores selling fresh food. The wealth gap is also largely responsible, not entirely. I'm oversimplifying a little bit in this talk, but there's no way to do it otherwise. I would keep you to dinner if I didn't oversimplify it a little bit. But it's also responsible in large part for the mass incarceration of young African American men that is such a scourge on this country. Somebody interrupted to say women as well. That's true, but not nearly to the extent of young men. The young men are incarcerated at a much, much higher rate than women, and black men at a much higher rate than white men. And I'm not suggesting that no police officer would ever abuse a young African American if it weren't for the wealth gap. But when you concentrate the most disadvantaged young people in single neighborhoods where they have no access to good jobs, no access to transportation to get to good jobs, no access to schools, as I described before, that aren't overwhelmed with social and economic problems. It's inevitable that they're going to be engaged in confrontations with the police, that the police are going to adopt tactics of control that are typical of disadvantaged, disenfranchised groups in concentrated neighborhoods. The tactics of control that police use in this country in low-income black neighborhoods that results in our mass incarceration is similar to the tactics that colonial forces used in the 20th century in the Congo or India or any other of the colonial countries. And the wealth gap is also responsible for something else that's very, very dangerous and frightening to me, and I assume to you as well. And that is the enormous political polarization that we have in this country today. That's greater than any time since the 1850s, before the Civil War. And it's understandable. I mean, how can we ever expect to develop the common national identity that's needed to preserve this democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that they have no ability to understand each other, no ability to empathize with each other, no ability to appreciate each other's life experiences? These are all the ongoing consequences today of federal policies followed in the 20th century to ensure that we be, as I said before, an apartheid society. Well, the policies of the FHA and VA are only one example. I think I have time perhaps to go into one other, and that's public housing. Public housing is something that we all, I think, misunderstand. Maybe some of you don't. Maybe you're smarter than I was. I misunderstood it before I started doing this research. We think of public housing as a place where poor people live. Lots of single mothers with children, lots of, as I said, young men without jobs in the formal economy. That's not how public housing began in this country. When public housing began in this country during the New Deal and the Depression, during the Roosevelt administration, poor people weren't permitted into public housing. Public housing was for working class families, middle class families, families who could afford housing, but who had no housing available because nothing was being constructed in the Depression. And the federal government built the first public housing in the 1930s in the history of this country for civilians. Of course, they always built housing on military bases, but the first civilian public housing was built throughout the country during the Roosevelt administration. And everywhere the Roosevelt administration built it, everywhere the New Deal built it, it segregated it, creating separate projects for whites, separate projects for African Americans, frequently segregating neighborhoods. Remember I talked to you about before about how many neighborhoods in urban areas weren't segregated at that time, segregating neighborhoods that hadn't previously been segregated. I'm sure that many of you, I hope many of you, are familiar with the work of the great African-American poet, novelist, playwright Langston Hughes. Read his autobiography, The Big C. In his autobiography, he describes how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. It's not how we think of downtown Cleveland today. But he said his best friend in high school was Polish. He said he dated a Jewish girl in high school. It was an integrated high school in an integrated neighborhood. What else would you expect? The Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood, demolished housing, and built two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed, and with other public projects elsewhere in the Cleveland area, contributed mightily to the pattern of segregation in Cleveland that exists still there today. And this went on all over the country. In my book, The Color of Law, I like to describe self-satisfied smug places that think they're better than you are. One of them, maybe you've heard of it, Cambridge, Massachusetts. The area between Harvard and MIT, the Central Square neighborhood, was a fully integrated neighborhood in the 1930s, about half white and half black. The federal government built two separate projects in that neighborhood, segregating it for the first time and creating a pattern of segregation with that and other projects that persist to this day. Well, the policies to redress segregation are well known. There is no mystery about them. Policy experts, developers, politicians, journalists write about them all the time. We know what to do. What's missing is not policy ideas. What's missing is a new civil rights movement, like we had in the 1960s, that's going to, in the words of the great late Congressman John Lewis, make some good trouble to insist that we take up our responsibilities as American citizens to redress segregation. I can give you a few examples of what those policies might look like. They're politically not feasible. today without the civil rights movement. I mentioned those suburbs that were created by the federal government, where homes now cost $300,000 perhaps, and African Americans were excluded when they were affordable to them for $100,000. When homes in those communities come up for sale, the federal government should be buying them up at market prices and reselling them to African Americans at a deeply discounted price. That would be a narrowly targeted remedy for a very explicit constitutional violation. If the courts did not willfully refuse to recognize the history of how this segregation happened under our Constitution, they would have to accept such a policy. They won't accept it until there's a popular movement that demands that they accept it. We also, as you know, and I'm sure many of you deal with this, we have a program, two programs actually, two large programs that subsidize housing for low-income families, disproportionately African American, increasingly Hispanic in this country. The biggest one is the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. It's a program that gives tax subsidies. The federal government gives tax subsidies to developers to build low-income housing units for families with low incomes who are disproportionately African American and Hispanic. The Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, both by its own regulations and by the inevitability of the conditions in which it works, disproportionately place those projects in existing low-income neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. It's nonsense. I'm not saying we shouldn't build low-income housing tax credit developments in low-income neighborhoods. Every neighborhood should have better housing. But to place almost all of them in low-income neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation, and allowing suburbs to exclude them because they have zoning ordinances that prohibit the construction of multi-unit structures is not only unconscionable, but it's also a violation of the Constitution because it perpetuates a segregation that was unconstitutionally created. The other program that we have that subsidizes the housing of low-income families, and you're all familiar with it, I'm sure, the Section 8 program, the Housing Choice Voucher program, also reinforces segregation, doing the opposite of what it should, because most Section 8 vouchers are usable only in low-income neighborhoods. They're usable in low-income neighborhoods because that's where landlords will accept them, because the way in which the voucher amount is calculated, it's based on an area-wide average, metropolitan area-wide average usually, or the average within a housing authority's jurisdiction, and the voucher is too little to afford rentals in high-opportunity neighborhoods. It's actually too much to afford housing in low-income segregated neighborhoods, and landlords typically exploit the program by charging more than the market would otherwise bear because the housing voucher is based on this area-wide average. That would be an easy thing to fix if we had the political will to do so. I'll mention in a minute somebody who's trying to fix it here in Milwaukee, but this is another area that will not change unless there's a popular movement that demand it. Well, I have the privilege of working with a group of national civil rights leaders who are at this point attempting to create something they call the Redress Movement, that's, whose role will be to organize or attempt to organize movements of activists, biracial movements of activists, whites and blacks, who are willing to undertake the hard work of creating mass movements to demand policies to redress segregation that, as I say, are constitutionally required. In conclusion, I want to introduce a couple of friends of mine who are here tonight who are working with that redress movement. One is Corey Perugini, whom I'm sure many of you know, who is on the national board of the redress movement. And we all wish that she and her colleagues have great success in doing this. And another is Reggie Jackson, who's on the local Milwaukee staff, whom you also know as well. Reggie, do you want to say something for a minute?
Thank you, Richard. Thank you all for being here. Just very quickly, The Redress Movement is a national organization. They're launching in 3 cities, Charlotte, Denver, Milwaukee. I'm part of the research team. We also have a digital organizing team and a community organizing team that will be doing work in Milwaukee. If any of you are interested in learning more about the Redress Movement as we're beginning the process of doing the work here in Milwaukee, myself and my colleague Brittany, if you could raise your hand. We have a clipboard that we'll be passing around. If you want to give us your information, you can get on our list, our email list, and we can send you information about what Redress is doing. We're really happy that this work comes out of Richard's book. Just a big fan of the fact that we need to get people collectively to do this work. We've been waiting for the change to happen. Let's be the change we want to see. So thank you.
Thank you, Reggie. And finally, I want to introduce a mentor of mine, someone who has inspired me in doing this work. She's here with us today. Tanika Johnson has created 2 things, and write this down. One is called the Folding Map Project. It's foldingmapproject.com, one word. And the other is Inequity for Sale. It's also Inequity. Inequityforsale.com. She's an artist, and she's from Chicago and has a lot to teach us here in Milwaukee. The Folding Map Project, the Folded Map Project, has brought together whites and blacks from white neighborhoods and black neighborhoods to begin the process of getting to know each other, which is an essential first step in creating a biracial movement to redress segregation. And you may recall that I mentioned in my talk that because the Federal Housing Administration would not issue or guarantee mortgages to African Americans in black neighborhoods, African Americans were exploited in a contract sale system in which they paid far more for homes than they would have paid if they were able to get legitimate mortgages, and frequently with contracts that were exploitative and dishonest and left them with nothing if they were evicted from homes that they thought they had bought. Tanika is in the process in Chicago of putting up landmarkers in front of these homes to advertise to people who walk by the history, and it has something they call a QR code. Is that what it's called? Yeah, you put your thingamajig on it, and you can learn the whole history about this. Tanika, would you stand up and just say hello? So I urge all of you to go to her websites and learn more about this, excuse me, and think about what you might do similar in Milwaukee. With that, I want to thank you very much for your attention, and good luck to all of you. Thank you.
For a few questions. We will not take longer than 10 minutes because we want to give the wait staff time to clear the table so that we can advance the rest of the presentation. So if Chantel, if you can raise your hand. We have mic runners in the room that will come to you with your with your question. Chantel, do you need another mic runner? Our mic, thank you so much.
Okay, definitely appreciate you coming and speaking. I want to get right to the chase. I can say personally, I want to see the people go to jail. You mentioned that this is a violation of the Constitution. I don't know how many lawyers are here, but it seems to me that people need to go to jail. This is something that when we talk about a civil rights movement, the civil rights movements began from legal action. Legal action cost a lot of money, so they needed promotion, so they got more people out to get things going. As you mentioned, it started out in legal schools. Again, that it needs to be a legal action. Where are our legal teams to address this? I don't care for lawyers personally in Wisconsin, but that's a whole other issue. But where are the legal teams to deal with the things that you clearly said was a constitutional violation?
That was a statement. I'll take a question as well. Well, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund does a lot of work challenging policies of segregation, but as I said, unless there's a political movement alongside it, it's not going to succeed in advancing us very far in this area.
You're saying that the political movements hadn't begun with legal action? My assessment is incorrect in history.
They were complementary. They were complementary.
Before people marched, they were suing.
Excuse me?
Before black people or people were marching, they were suing in the courts.
Well, and not very successfully.
But it built the foundation for what we have today.
All right.
Good afternoon. I'm Michelle Hassan from Zion Benton Township High School District. I'm the Director of Equity and Engagement there. And I just wanted to thank you all for putting this program on today. And thank you really, I'm sorry, I don't have a question, but I just had to say thank you for writing this book because there were so many questions I had. Or my father worked for the Department of Housing and Urban Development for over 30 years. And so there were so many things with me being involved in education and him being involved in housing that this book explained for me. And I just want to say thank you for being willing to tell the truth about what happened. And I don't know if it's a forgotten history. I think it's more of a hidden history, but it definitely answered questions about what happened. So I just wanted to thank you for that truth.
Well, may I comment about that? It was not hidden. Everybody who, for example, bought a home with a deed that said that they could not resell it to an African American knew it. Everybody who lived in a public housing project that was segregated by race knew it. So this was not we've forgotten it because it's hard to deal with, and we'd rather not think about it. But in the mid-20th century, everybody knew that the federal government and state and local governments were perpetuating segregation.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Bianca Shaw, and I live here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I'm here representing the Wisconsin Department of Children and Families today. And my question, I want to first say thank you for your presentation, and I think my question goes to the allyship that I do in my advocacy work in regards to First Nations and tribal nations. I really feel that the barrier to liberation of African Americans in this country is also brought about because of the divide and the lack of communication that we have with our tribal nations. And so I'm wondering, is there any type of discussion and understanding that that is something separate and different? But I do think that it's important to understand the connections that our tribal nations have to the African American experience within our country, and understanding how we can understand what happened to them, what is happening to us, and link that to make sure that it's fixed. Because ultimately, when I think about, my 40 acres, I think back, that 40 acres didn't even belong to those individuals who stole it from the Native Americans. So even if we are able to come to a place where we can have African Americans gaining the generational wealth through housing, what does that mean for our Native American brothers and sisters, and how do we begin to have that conversation so that it is all inclusive of all of the crimes, because these are crimes against humans in this country and the continuing of the dehumanization of the African American.
I'm going to go to that side, then it'll be you next, okay?
So that was a question. I wanted to know.
Oh, well.
I'm sorry. So I want to know, I know that there's not a lot of, research in regards to Natives, African Americans, but how does that come into play? Because for me, 30 years from now, I'm 40, and so I don't want to, be working at this, another 40 or 80 years, right? And so I'm thinking that the connection with Native Americans and African Americans is so very important, because our United States government, as long as we keep that separate, our United States government will never have to be held necessarily accountable by law. So in your opinion, how do we, or should we, I'm going to ask you, maybe you think we should not collaborate or have those discussions, but for me, and thinking about 30 years from now, I still think that when advocating, we do have to consider our tribes when we're doing this work.
No, of course I agree that it's connected. We have a history of discrimination, exploitation, and sometimes violence, extreme violence in the case of Native Americans. We have a history of state-sponsored discrimination against Hispanics, against Asians, and all of those need to be addressed. Nobody can address all of them at once. I wrote this book on a narrow topic, which is how metropolitan areas came to be racially segregated. And I look forward to reading your book about the history of the exploitation of tribals, peoples.
Hi, my name is Shawnee Malone. I work for SDC. My question is this, because I personally experienced this. My parents in '76, they bought a home in Bayside, and we were one of two black families that lived there, and we constantly went through a lot of drama, having our yard burned with a cross on it, being judged because they wanted to know why my parents would come live out there, and it was a predominantly Jewish area. But my question is this, going forward, especially with a lot of things that were implemented by the governor, but not the governor, the government, is still ran by the same people. And I understand we have to vote at the local level, you know, to make change. However, a lot of people think there won't be any change. So it's like, how do we be solution focused? What do we do from now? Because this is like on and on and on. So where does the change come from? Where do we start? So this won't continue to be like this.
Well, you know, as I said, I think it won't come unless there's a popular movement. If you think it's hard to see how we can make change today, try to imagine how hard it seemed when I was young, when we had segregated restaurants and segregated restrooms and segregated lunch counters and segregated buses. It seemed impossible. When I was young, I'll tell you this one quick story. When I was a young man in my early 20s, this was in the early 1960s, I had a job as a researcher and a research assistant at the Chicago Urban League. And my job, one of the research tasks that I had, was to go through, there was no internet in those days, so you had these great big giant manuals that were directories of every company in the city of Chicago. And it listed the telephone numbers if you wanted to reach any executive. Anyone from the shipping and receiving manager to the personnel director. We didn't have human resources in those days, they were personnel directors. Any executive. And I had to count up the number of these positions. I counted up in the private sector of Chicago, there were some 4,000 supervisory executive level positions, and I had to identify how many of them were occupied by an African American, how many of these 4,000. So how many do you think there were? Huh?
None.
Zero. Zero.
None.
Zero. None.
None.
Now, if you had told me, well, I was probably too young and unsophisticated to understand, but if you had told my research director, my boss, that in just 15 years, you couldn't have a corporation in Chicago that didn't at least have some, at least mid-level executives who are African American, he would have said, you're crazy. That can't happen for several generations. Well, it did happen, and it happened because we had a civil rights movement in this country that changed the way we had to respond. So I agree, it looks impossible now. It may look impossible 10 years from now, but the only way we can make it possible is by stepping up to the task and making it possible.
It's funny that I didn't get the young lady's name. Shauna made that distinction because because I want to talk about the racism and the systemic racism in policy and procedure, and that kind of correlates to what she just said and what you just spoke on. When she said, well, when are we going to see the change? We just keep talking about it. Well, there's racism and racial barriers and policy and procedures all the way around. Don't get me started on this topic. But yeah, you know, there's racism and policy and procedure. When are we going to see the change? When?
Only you can answer that question when you make it happen. I can't predict.
We're down to our last two questions. We have one over there, and the last one will be over here.
2 minutes.
I seem to always get the 2-minute warning. Look, I don't know everywhere I go. But I don't know if it's too loud. But you shared something that I've been thinking about a lot, about the federal government creating segregation. Like, in so many words, how could we ever think of like being one community? You know what I'm saying, with the federal government separating us. And I always felt like the only time that we have a shared identity as Americans is when we overseas. Now we overseas, we American, you know what I'm saying? Everybody love the flag, but once we get back, once you get on the plane to come back, hey, we separate. And I was listening to this historian, and he said there's never been a group of people who were slaves, and once they threw off the yoke of slavery, stayed with their enslavers in that community. And he don't know, as far as American and slavery, like how long would it take for us to have like a shared identity, you know what I'm saying, as Americans? So we don't have a shared identity, you know what I'm saying, just period. He's like, would it take 100 years, 200, 500, and with these policies that's set by the American government, right, I have no answer to this question. What about you?
Well, I think you did have an answer to that question. You started off with it. The military is the one non-segregated institution in American society, and it works. People work together, and they see that each other are human, and they wind up getting along with each other. And as I said before, it's impossible to conceive of how we can have a common national identity if we're living so far apart and so separate and never have any interaction with each other, except in servant relationships or employee relationships or employer relationships. That's why I recommend to you, as I did before, and I hope you will, you'll look at foldedmapproject.com, because it's an effort in Chicago to begin to bring whites and blacks together to dismantle the stereotypes they have of each other. And it can happen as well, but the military is the proof that it can work if only we make it we decide to make it happen.
All right, last question. Hi there, my name is Max. I'm an MPS high school student, and I was actually wondering if you have any advice for this next generation who's trying to fight against the achievement gap. I know I'm very interested in dedicating my life to fighting against the achievement gap, with one of my parents being an educator who also is devoting her life to that. And I was wondering if you have any advice for this upcoming generation who's looking to fighting against the achievement gap.
Well, I don't have any advice for you myself, but as I said, we need a movement here in Milwaukee as well as we do everywhere to begin the process that you're talking about. And Reggie Jackson offered to take your name and contact information if you want to be part of a movement to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rothstein, for great thought-provoking presentation for us, and took us back in time to make us remember not only what it used to be like, but some of the struggles that I remember as a young person that took place. And as some of our folks who are not as seasoned as I am, want to know why we're still there, is because we're not done. I'm going to put that out there. We're not done. What we started never got finished. What we started in terms of housing, education, health care, whatever you want us to call it, we started it. But somewhere along the line, we must have thought it was over with because we didn't continue the process. And when I say we, somebody asks, well, what are we going to do? We got to do it. Who's going to do it? We got to do it. It is us. I keep talking about SDC and our role to help work on issues around race inequities, sex inequities, homophobia inequities, policies and systems inequities. But guess what? SDC can't do it. It's us. As the people, we have to do it. We have to reimagine that we have the power, because we do. We absolutely have the power, which was demonstrated through the 60s, that we forgot that we still have, to make change. And all SDC wants to be as a convening agency is to help put processes in place for us to think through, think about, hear, remember, ask the questions, and then come up with community solutions. And it can't be when we're upset about something that happened. It has to be ongoing, deep thought, discussion, and action to make significant transformational change. I'm excited about Reggie's work and the work that they're going to be doing. But I'm also excited about SDC and what we're going to do. Our commissioners have charged us with thinking through ways in which we can work with our community on all issues that affect people in poverty, all issues that deal with inequalities everywhere. And in Milwaukee, they look a certain way, especially Milwaukee County. So it defines us and our actions depending on what we experience in our community, our unique community called Milwaukee County, in which we still see extreme segregation. Not only people of color who are black and white, but also my brothers in the brown community, who are all very segregated. And we need to figure out how to, I don't know if I'm gonna say end segregation as much as in this segregated mindset. Because if the mindset is segregated, I don't think we can ever stop being segregated. So we have to end it by understanding that the problems that we have are not based on race specifically. Racism may be causing us to stay in this condition, but understanding some of the systems that create economic and political influences on how we respond to problems. That's another whole long story, and I'll do that another time. In this particular case, though, we just want to go through, and we just heard some really great presentations around housing. And we had an expert that not only understands, he says he's not an expert on housing, but on education. All of it applies. But I'm going to bring up Frank Martinelli. Frank Martinelli has been around. We have been around a long time. Sounds better? We have been around a while. And Frank has been working with us to reimagine or reengage the agency in the work of SDC's commission. And one of those works is to really work with our community and get them engaged in thinking through what is the answer, how do you go through the process of looking for the answer. And so Frank's going to take us through an exercise. I'm going to let him introduce himself. He's been around a while. And the reason why I say that is because when we talked about SDC of the old, at the very beginning, Frank was talking about how he was engaged as well, way back when SDC was a very young organization, very vibrant and exciting and challenging, in your face, good trouble agency. And we are going to do that again. And so we look for you to help us be that good trouble agency by bringing your time, talent, and volunteer work to us as well. Frank Martinelli.
A moment ago when George was talking about how long I've been around, I was half expecting him to announce my 100th birthday party would be celebrated soon. But I do have a couple of comments. As I begin, I don't know if Max is still in the room, but your question, any advice, I've got some advice for you, and just hold on for about 10 minutes. If you can. All right, well, if whoever, yeah, here we go. Can you advance the slide? Okay, great, thanks a lot. So I'm going to talk for just a couple of minutes to describe some of the new direction that SDC has committed to. And I think the important point to make is that, we're going to be talking about advocacy, we're going to be talking about public policy work. Let's not forget that a long time ago, during those early years of SDC's efforts in this community, it was a leader in advocacy and public policy work. So this new focus on advocacy and public policy is not brand new. It's really a recommitment to something that is really central to what SDC has always been about. But in terms of my comments, I want to talk a little bit about that renewed commitment to advocacy and public policy work. I want to talk about root cause analysis as the key to transformational change. Dr. Hinton a moment ago was talking about what will it take to achieve transformational change in our community. Richard Rothstein was certainly talking about what's it going to take to achieve transformational change. So where does root cause analysis fit in? And then I'd like to end with just a couple of comments about how we move in this direction together. I think Dr. Hinton alluded to it, that SDC sees itself as a convener. The work ahead is so big and so challenging that no one organization could ever think that it could do the work on its own. Can you activate the clicker? Thanks, okay. All right, so I've begun to talk about SDC's renewed commitment to advocacy and public policy work, in addition to the important direct services that it has delivered for a long, long time. On this journey, there have been a couple of foundational themes I'd like to quickly share with you. The first is that advocacy, as SDC sees it, is something that is deeply rooted in its new strategic plan. So this is not a side activity, it's not just a minor emphasis, but it's at the very heart, it's a hallmark feature of the kind of organization and the kind of impact that SDC intends to have in the next couple of years, with your help. Secondly, and this is really important, the advocacy, the public policy work will reflect the community's own voice. Historically, one of the problems with a lot of otherwise good advocacy and public policy work, it's been too much of a top-down affair. People who know a lot of stuff, and we certainly appreciate their knowledge and their expertise and their background, sort of leading the charge. SDC is looking for ways to really engage the authentic voices of the community whose future is at stake. So that'll be a real critical element. And the one that I really want to talk about, the third foundational theme, systems-informed advocacy, getting to the root causes of community problems. So SDC is not just talking about advocacy and public policy work, it's talking about advocacy and public policy work rooted in a deep understanding of why these problems don't go away. What are the root causes that up to this point we've failed to really address? And so I really want to focus on this last foundational theme. The work that we've done over the last year in helping to build the capacity of SDC for this renewed focus on advocacy and public policy work is rooted in some important work from the Othering and Belonging Institute, the work of John Powell. Many of you may be familiar with his work. He has made a distinction, an important distinction, and Dr. Hinton has reminded us of this important distinction a number of times. The difference between transactional change and transformational change. If we're wondering why stuff is not changing the way we want it to and the way we hope for it to, it's because historically we focused a little too much, and maybe that's an understatement, a lot on transformational change, transactional change, and not transformational change. So let's talk about it. Transactional change, and this is from the work of John Powell and the Othering and Belonging Institute. It works within the existing systems and institutional structures, and it focuses on individuals who are being hurt by those institutions and those structures. And when we're operating in the transactional change mode, the question with respect to poverty, the question that we might ask ourselves is, why is this individual person or family poor? And if that's the question, the response often is, what can we do to help that individual, to help that family? And we have to do that. There's no question about it. But transactional change is something, transformational change is something different. With the transformational change focus, we're looking at more fundamental changes in the very structures and systems that are affecting people. It's important because this kind of change lasts longer, so it's more durable over time. We're getting to the causes of problems, not just the symptoms of problems. And it really challenges us to change the systems that are creating the problems and the need for services to individuals. And we want to make it very clear, it's not an either or. We have to continue to provide quality services, responsive services, trauma-informed services to people in desperate need today. But that good work is not good enough. We have to join that work to the deeper systems change work. And in the transformational change mindset or mode, we ask a question about poverty very, very different from that first question. In the transformational change mode or mindset, the question is, why is there persistent and widespread poverty in Milwaukee? What is it about the way Milwaukee is structured that produces widespread and persistent poverty? Now, if that's the question that we ask, what we begin to think about is something very, very different than providing needed services to individuals. And one more time, we need to do both. But let's talk about how we begin to lay the groundwork for transformational change. It's all about defining root causes, the deep root causes, and you can see the definition on screen. It comes from an important organization, the Building Movement Project, based in New York, but working throughout the country. Here's their definition of root causes: underlying factors and forces that create community problems and make those problems likely to persist even though services may be in place to help individuals and families meet their immediate needs. So it's all about going deeper, to really deepen our understanding of why these problems exist in our community and why, after years and years of heroic efforts by so many organizations and individuals, many of whom are in this room, why those problems don't go away. And for me, in thinking about Richard Rothstein's important work, what that work exposed are the deep root causes of residential segregation. And the thing about advocacy, especially systems-informed advocacy, that really asks that question, what are the deep root causes of the problem before we get to action, is that frequently when we do root cause analysis, as Mr. Rothstein did, we begin to discover that there are laws, there are regulations, there are systems in place that work below the surface. Often we're not aware of them until we do this kind of root cause analysis. Some good news. There are a lot of very accessible, user-friendly tools that enable us to begin to figure out what are those deep root causes. One tool, pretty straightforward, it's called the Keep Asking Why Worksheet, and I think you can probably imagine why it's called that. We look at the problem and we just repeatedly ask ourselves, why is this happening? And then we ask again, why is this happening? And again and again. And with this tool and with a few of the others that we're going to take a real quick look at, it really is about going deeper. And I think that this is an important activity. All of us can do this. And especially when SDC talks about really engaging the community in this work, just imagine residents, community leaders themselves doing this work of root cause analysis, coming to this discovery of why these problems that affect us don't go away. There's real power in that, creating that new knowledge together. Here's an example from the Building Movement Project. The high school dropout rate in many of our high schools. Why is this happening? We're often told youth making bad choices, schools can't keep students interested. Why is this happening? Disenfranchised communities, schools that are under-resourced. Why is this happening? Lack of equitable school funding in poor communities. Why is this happening? Poor people lack power. Poor people and their allies often lack power. Here's another one. As you know, SDC and several other organizations in our community have been working to forestall evictions over the last 2 years. So let's ask ourselves, why does this heightened risk of eviction exist for poor people? Lack of sufficient resources to pay rent on time. Low-wage jobs that don't provide sufficient income. Why? Lack of living wage jobs. And we can go deeper, really trying to understand at a deeper level. This knowledge of why things happen, this knowledge of why the problems that we've worked so hard to remove gives us some new ideas about what the strategies should be. And so again, SDC's intent is to really incorporate this root cause analysis approach before deciding on public policy strategies, before deciding on advocacy strategies. And certainly the community needs assessment that is currently underway, that Jennifer talked to us about, will be an important source of some of that root cause knowledge. I don't want to take time. Here's just another example of that Keep Asking Why worksheet. But in all of the examples that we might look at, the goal is to create an opportunity for people, for leaders, for residents, for allied organizations to go deeper, to come to that deeper understanding of why the problem exists. One of the things that we've talked about in our work internally with SDC is the importance of understanding the difference between a root cause and a symptom. And so again, you can see the slide, the example that we'd like to offer. Lack of sufficient resources to pay rent on time is not a root cause of poverty. It's a consequence of being poor. So that distinction is important. We have to deal with both. Again, I want to make that real clear. Direct services and advocacy and public policy work joined together. So we need to be clear about what the root causes of poverty are and figure out approaches to address those root causes. At the same time, we need to be concerned about some of the factors, some of the contributing factors that intensify the impact of poverty. Another tool that I think is, again, really accessible, what I like about the iceberg worksheet is that even if we haven't done root cause analysis, all of us use that expression. We're talking to people about something going on. Hey, that's only the tip of the iceberg. Just suggesting that there is more going on below the surface. So this use of the iceberg symbol or metaphor, I think, is a real accessible way of beginning to get people to think and talk about root causes. So with respect to poverty, above the water, what we can see on a daily basis, the symptoms of poverty. Just below the surface of the water, contributing factors, some of the things that are going on that intensify poverty or contribute to it. It's important to have that understanding of contributing factors, but it's not enough. We've got to go deeper. What are the underlying root causes? What contributes to the contributing factors? And I think historically, our analysis has sort of stopped there at the middle level. We've got to go deeper. And I don't want to suggest that many of you aren't thinking in these terms. I think this kind of thinking goes on. What's needed, and what I think SDC hopes to be a part of, is a critical mass of organizations in our community united around a shared understanding of those deep root causes, and then developing a collective agenda for public policy work and advocacy. That's the missing piece. And I don't know, I may be the oldest person in this room, I don't know. But I can tell you that the problems haven't gone away in the last 50 years, I can tell you that. So let's look at an example. Poor health outcomes, associated with the condition of being poor, living in poverty. In the last several years, we've come to a deeper understanding of what are referred to as the social determinants. And that's good news. That's going deeper in our understanding of why there are poor health outcomes, race and economic-based disparities. So that's good news. But again, we have to go deeper. What are the underlying root causes that produce the social determinants? What are the determinants of the social determinants? And you can see them, we all know what they are. I don't think Milwaukee is unique. We're certainly talking more about systemic racism in the last couple of years than we have before. But we don't talk a lot in our community about income inequality, extreme income inequality. We don't talk about the very structure of our economy. The fact that our community relies on an army of primarily black and brown low-wage workers. And then if we're talking about health, and this is America, right? Certainly one of the underlying root causes is the U.S. healthcare system. Certainly the most expensive in the world. So just understanding, going deeper, that's really the key. One more tool in the time that we have. One more tool, just real quickly. This is from the Building Movement Project. And by the way, if you're not familiar with the Building Movement Project, I know Mr. Rothstein is involved with them. Maybe I got it wrong. But in any case, my apologies if I misspoke. But the Building Movement Project, buildingmovementproject.org, it's an incredible resource for a lot of what we've been talking about. So pretty straightforward. You can see it on the screen, 3 columns. The column over on the left, what's the symptom, what's the condition of poverty that we want to address? In the middle column, some initial thinking about some of the root causes of that symptom or that condition, but then not stopping there, asking the question again, what are the root causes of the root cause? An example, again, using the one that we looked at a moment ago, lack of sufficient resources to pay rent on time. Column 2, low-income households lack sufficient financial padding or rainy day fund to cover emergencies. Low-wage employment that doesn't produce sufficient income. And then in the rightmost column, again, looking at the middle column, what are the root causes of those causes? Lack of living wage employment which disproportionately affects people of color. Lack of living wage jobs, again, which disproportionately affect people of color. Lack of education, which disproportionately affects people of color. Well, in the time that we have left, I thought it might be helpful to just think a little bit about the following 2 questions. You know, and I think it reinforces Dr. Hinton's message earlier that SDC sees itself as a convener, not going to do all of this by itself. What will it take for our community to begin to move in this direction? And so the questions, what would it take for our community to unite around collective efforts to achieve transformational change? And the related question, what barriers would we in Milwaukee have to overcome to move in this direction? Someone, I don't know who it is, has described our fair city as the city that moves with all deliberate slowness. And if you know who the author is, let me know, and I'll give them credit. So we've got a lot to work with. Thinking of Reggie and others, we're in good shape, but we're trying to do this work in a community that sometimes thinks it's doing great work, but in reality, more could be expected. So here's what I'd like to suggest. Again, we don't have a lot of time. At your tables, if you could just take maybe about 5 minutes to bat these 2 questions around. We're certainly going to be asking these questions again. What would it take for our community to unite around collective efforts to achieve transformational change? And related to that, what barriers would we in our community have to overcome to move in this direction? Again, if you would just take about 5 minutes. please take another minute, one more minute. Can we get together again, please? And we don't necessarily have time to hear from all tables, but maybe just a couple of comments from your table discussion. What would it take for our community to unite around collective efforts to achieve transformational change? And what are some of the barriers that would have to be overcome for our Milwaukee to move in this direction? Anyone?
I think it's a very deep-seated question. I believe it was based in religion. That's about the closest I could come to that. Otherwise, the entire disposition of our approach to it, to our community problems, is a religious question. Dealing universally. When you say we,
All right, thank you. Thanks for getting us started. The importance of faith. Some others.
I have the desire for the need, whatever that need is. And then I fear of our barriers. We came up with our own passion. How much time and effort are we willing to put into that particular passion? Outreach, we were talking about outreach, and the description that was given to me was getting even to the streets around our businesses that we're in. Not necessarily outreach with me sitting in my own clinic and talking to my own people, but to talk out to the streets or the houses that are around, right, that area. So that would be the getting out there part. And we touched on education. I'm not quite sure, because in my head I think to myself, I'm not really sure that we need people who are extremely educated to be able to have some kind of passion. So, but those were the lists that we had.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. And if I can make a quick comment with respect to education, it certainly helps, but let's remind ourselves that most of the movements throughout the world that are changing history, changing the course of history, very often are led by people without degrees of any kind. So some of the skills, some of the knowledge that is needed doesn't automatically come from more formal education. Not that you were necessarily suggesting that, but let's remember how things are changing. Other questions, and this light is sort of in the way, so.
Question I have is that we're from a suburb in Menominee Falls, and we're part of what we call a racial justice team. So I have a question I had particularly is, what will it take for our community to create change? And then what do we need to overcome?
What did you come up with?
We're working on it.
Okay.
A couple of things I looked at was, I was looking at transactional and versus transformational and root causes. How do we answer those questions? But there's, I don't know, I've come to it, we could probably come up with, I think your example of what would you call it, agendas or what up there would be useful. But coming from, well, we moved from Milwaukee to Menominee Falls, so I guess once we thought about it, that wasn't a good move, but we're there, so. But anyway, it's just a very interesting for people like myself to listen to all.
Yeah, I mean, speaking for myself, I think it is really important and a powerful act to have moved to a place like Menominee Falls. We need to be there, right? Again, I can't really see, so just shout out.
Yeah, my name is Ian Carter. I'm a Madison area realtor. I also work with a group called Own It, Building Black Wealth. And I think a direct answer to the question is actually what we're tackling. A lot of my colleagues actually had to leave, unfortunately, that were with us. But it really comes back kind of to piggyback off what you're saying, was from an aspect of education. And not only just educating those of us who are in here and have been engaged in this fight for years, decades, or however long, but also engaging the youth. One of the things that stood out to me was that I don't see a lot of people representing the age demographic that Max is representing, and ultimately those are the people who will be in power and will be running the things. So how is it that we can engage them is a question that I'm trying to answer. And part of it is once we do engage, so I'm not so sure about that, but once we do engage them, it's about giving them information. Part of what we do with Own It is we have a wealth building course, then that's followed up by a home ownership course, then that's followed up with a $15,000 grant towards down payment of a home. So we're giving education of how to manage these funds, we're giving education of how to manage this asset, which is a home, and then we're also giving substantive, monetary rewards to those who need it with no strings attached. So I think ultimately it comes down to education, and it comes down to targeting the future, because those are the ones that really need to be in these conversations, not those of us who are, kind of closer to the out than we are to the in.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, you also use the word engagement a couple of times, and I think that's really important. And that reminds me of the bit of advice I was going to give to you. One bit of advice I would have, some of what we've been talking about, systems thinking, applying those root cause analysis tools, there is so much good information about how to do that. Learn those skills, master those skills, and engage other people your age in those activities. I mean, again, that theme of engagement. It's really, really important. It took me, I think I was in my mid-30s before I read my first book on systems thinking. And it was really life-changing. It's just changed how I look at just about everything, especially the work that I do. So that's certainly my advice. Learn how to do it and then engage people your age, people our age, in that activity. And then use the knowledge that comes out of that root cause analysis before you decide what actions are you going to take. Yes?
Thank you so much. I've learned so much just in the short time you've been speaking. And I just want to say to the gentleman that asked the question about Menominee Falls, just give one suggestion. I think that people that live in any land should begin to acknowledge the land, the ancestral land that we're on, and acknowledge that it is not, historically your land, and allow that for them to invite others in their space. And with that being said, I think that the other thing that I notice in the suburbs, I work for the state, but I hear about how when African Americans, when we begin to make it, we begin to move out to the suburbs. But what I see is a lot of mental health issues within our adults as well as our children. And I think that as a community, just thinking about how you can care about your neighbors' mental health and their well-being will be a place to start. For us, we started with the question about what barriers would you have to overcome to move in this direction. And one of my colleagues talked about and what I summed it up, what she was saying is that the marketing, so we have, Wisconsin and Milwaukee has the resources to care for its people, but are we collaborating in a way to make that an impact? So making sure that when we have these resources that there is a marketing budget, so you have a $10 million budget, but you only have $100 for marketing, that doesn't make sense. So I think that that's a place to start to make sure that there is money for marketing. But for me, I was born in Milwaukee. I was born in West Lime, but I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and the communities are just different. You know, here I feel like I'm in a place now where I'm an appointed official, so people want to meet with me. But 6 months before I got into that position, I was the same person, and nobody wanted to meet with me or work with me. And so we have to actually become real with ourselves and stop segregating ourselves from one another and understand that integration does not mean assimilation. I think that a lot of us, when we integrate into communities or we go into communities, we are either expected to assimilate or we move into those communities with losing who we are and not really being true to ourselves. And so back to the question of what barriers we have to overcome, Milwaukee, like Black people, we really have to get our own segregated mindset together because our funds are segregated, our communities are segregated. And for me, I'm gonna be honest, like when I heard Reggie and my friend Brittany doing this really great thing, it's like it takes people outside of our state to come in and believe in the work that has been going on for so long, and it shouldn't be that way. And so for me, it's just really important for me at the state level. And there was a slide you had up and it said like poor people lack power. And I'm not gonna say I totally disagree. I think we lack privilege. We have power. We just leave our power on the table by not knowing our worth, by not coming together collectively to say like, I need this change, because that's the only way that government will move. As a former legislative staff, if I were to get 3 phone calls on one issue in an office, I'm going to check up on that issue. But as the gentleman was saying earlier, if we are not addressing the issues collectively to those powers that be, then they won't, put forth any effort to minimize those things. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. I think it's time to turn it back to, well, after maybe one more comment, but to turn it back to Abra and Dr. Hinton.
I think we have 2 more comments.
Okay.
And then Abra.
All right. I like to say for the person in Menominee Fall or anywhere else you at, I'm saying you just got to use your agency. Wherever you at, use your agency for fairness, to be just, for inclusion, and every other good thing that us being human beings. And part of the problem is that if you don't see nobody as a human being, then you don't address them or their issues or their struggle in a human way. You know what I'm saying? Where we live at in America, especially like Black man, we see on the news, like we social ills, period. Every time our name come up, we bad fathers, we bad everything. Unless, we working in some body industry or something like that. So what you want to do with a social ill, get rid of it. And then once you're getting rid of it is a social good, like mass incarceration, death, what have we. You know what I'm saying? We got to quit articulating that we all bad in that sense. Next thing, we need people at every tier. We need the educators. We need, the truck driver. We need everybody to articulate about like where we trying to go, housing, or whatever issue we got. We need everybody to articulate it and explain it to the next person. And the next thing I got to say, you already said everybody already too busy trying to pay bills. Nobody don't got time to be sitting down, trying to read no paper, trying to read no pamphlet, trying to listen to no thing. So all those who can do that, you do that, then go articulate it to your other people who too busy and just summarize it. And say, can I get your support? The next thing, we need the educated people and the lived experience people at the same table. We just don't need the educated people talking about the issue from an educated point of view. We need the people that's on the ground and the educated people together doing it like that in that sense. And then the thing is articulate our mission, articulate our mission, articulate our mission. All right, here we go.
Thank you. One more, I think.
Yeah, and then we have Abra.
Okay, I just want to say this as far as what he was saying as far as the youth and stuff. I got 7 grandkids, so I know what it means to start from, the kids and on up. And I'm not trying to toot our horn, but I am going to say SDC, that's what we do. We have a youth advisory board. And I'm the youth and family services supervisor. We get out there because we know it's going to start with the youth. But one thing that I can say, and I'm talking to myself as well, when we get to looking at people and say, well, what are you going to do? No, it's not what are you going to do, what am I going to do? So it takes one to make one, to reach one, and go on and on. So instead of me trying to figure out, okay, what can the next person do? What can I do starting at my level? Be it my grandkids, being the youth I work with, being the people I work in the department with, being SDC, that's what we got to do. And so instead of keep looking, and when I say this, I'm speaking on me as well, when I keep looking at the next person, what you going to do, no, what am I going to do? And how can I help you do what you're going to do, what you're going to do, what you're going to do so we can make it? Because I know it can happen. I know it can happen. I also know as youth, they're our future. So they've got to know. It's not, they got to know what's going on. We got to empower them so they can know and make it better. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thanks for the opportunity to talk to you about some of the advocacy and public policy directions that SDC is headed into. Thank you.
Frank, stay there. Stay there for me, because we still got to round our table out. This was the final statement, and then we can let everybody leave. I was hoping that our collaborators hadn't gotten out of the room so that we can make the talk about the statement that Frank gave us. One of the things that we do a poor job at in the Milwaukee County is recognizing that we are true collaborators. Organizations that do the kind of work that we do have been historically pitted against each other for funding purposes. And what SDC has been trying to impart on our collaborators is we are willing collaborators. We don't profess to do it all, but we commit to our charge to be conveners and to elevate the work that our collaborators do. And so many times our collaborators exit early or, come for the opportunity to elevate work singularly. And it's important that we understand how we work as a collective together to be inclusive of, like the brother said, those who don't have formal education but have lived experience. I'm that poster child. I'm a lifelong learner. Okay, and so for those organizations, like Ms. Shaw said, one of the reasons why this community engagement exercise is happening and it's going to be ongoing is we have to reteach that lost knowledge of community power. Our community has forgotten that we wield real power, and so if you don't hear anything from what we intend to do, when we talk community engagement, we mean to engage the community at all touch points. Our collaborators, our end users, because the experience of poverty, lived experience of poverty is daunting. That's why our work is so daunting, because we understand, and we have to figure out how to be better and more efficient at the work that we do as collaborators so that we can elevate and lift this work and impact the end user. So I think I said what our table intended for me to say, but there was so much that went on between there that it was important that our collaborators hear what our intention is. We are not your competitor. We are here to elevate the work that makes the impact on the root cause. Right, Frank?
You got it.
Awesome. Having said that, Frank, do you have anything to contribute?
I don't.
Excellent. So we want to thank you for attending this community engagement series. Our next targeted date is July 28th. Dr. Hinton has made the commitment to community that we will continue to do this because we recognize that this is not a quick fix. We ask you to stay in, stay committed, and we ask that the next time you bring somebody. Our folks from Menominee Falls, invite your collaborators. The brother that talked about people with lived experience, invite your people with lived experience, because this is the space. And it's free. That's another thing about our leader, recognizing that we have to eliminate barriers to access to this kind of resource that uplifts and educates and empowers and emboldens. And one more thing. And our youth, the brother with the youth group, make sure you collaborate with the young lady, Shanae, who collaborates with our youth council so that we can make sure our youth participate in the work that you do as well. And so somebody has asked for a quick announcement before we close, but after this, thank you for coming on behalf of Dr. Hinton and our Board of Commissioners. It has been a great exercise. Dr. Rothstein sends his regards and uplift.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I am so glad to be out of the COVID and back into the real gist of everything, so I'm really happy to be here. My name is Terry Elzie, and I work for Mental Health America, Wisconsin. I'm the Clinical Director of Services. So tomorrow, if you have nothing to do, we are having a WISE event. WISE is the Initiative for Stigma Elimination, and we are inviting people to a symposium, the intersection of race and mental health. And so this is going to be held at the Marquette Alumni Center, and so you are all invited to attend, but you have to register first. And like SDC, it is a hybrid conference, so you can either come in person or you can do it virtually. So I just wanted to invite everybody, because that's tomorrow. The time is, thank you, from 8:30 to 12:30 p.m.
One more announcement, and then please consider yourselves dismissed. Oh, I'm sorry. One more thing.
Sorry, this is another invitation. On April 27th, we are Bay Bridge. If you go to baybridgewisconsin.org, sorry, baybridgewisconsin.org. We are doing a collaboration with UWM and Reggie Jackson, actually. I don't know if Reggie is still here, but, and it is going to be on mapping racism and resistance. You can read about the event if you go there onto baybridgewisconsin.org. And it's about racial covenants.
So thank you everybody for joining us today. Again, our next community engagement series is on July 28th, right here, right back at the Hyatt. And so if you are watching virtually, we appreciate you all coming on. We had about 100 people who joined us today virtually, so we appreciate everybody who has come on and enjoyed this discussion and engagement that we have. So if you do know somebody who can't make it in person, they can always join virtually. Tomorrow, SDC has board elections. And so in our districts 5 and 6, we are going to have an election for our newest commissioners who sit on our board. So if you live in those districts 5 and 6, you can go to our website, cr-sdc.org, and get more information on that. And we encourage you to come out to the elections. We also have some save the date cards on your tables here. And if you're watching virtually, you saw some of the ads that were coming across as we were lunching and as you were waiting for us to start. We have the Legacy Gala, which is our Social Development Foundation that is going to be having that in October 16th, Sunday, October 16th. And then we also have our save the date for the Summit on Poverty, which is October 25th through the 27th at the Wisconsin Center District. So we invite you to mark those dates on your calendar. More information will be coming, but we plan to see you back here on July 28th. And don't forget to complete your community needs assessment survey. So we appreciate your time today and have a great day.